Yeah, so I should actually tell you first that, I'm not a historian on American history. I'm a historian of Vietnamese history. So that is, I know much more there. But yes, so they were, when the Marine base in Khe Sanh was besieged by the People's Army, the leadership of the United States wanted to avoid a second Dien Bien Phu. Right? And so they were afraid of the consequences if the Marine base would fall to the People's Army. And so there are indications that there were ideas about or plans to use tactical nuclear weapons around Khe Sanh. Thankfully, they did not come to pass. On the other hand, given how intertwined the battlefield is around Khe Sanh, it's very difficult to even think about how that would have played out, because the revolutionary forces and the American forces are very close to one another and intertwined. American forces are on some mountains, and of course they are on in the base themselves, but revolutionary forces are intertwined there. So it's very hard to think how such a use of these powerful weapons would have worked. On the other hand, the first strike of nuclear weapons is an immoral act that thankfully never happened.
Yes, thank you. And please comment on President Nixon's visit to China and what were the main purpose of Shanghai Declaration?
So you're asking me about President Nixon's visit to Beijing in the spring of 1972. And this is, of course, a very important event in terms of the Vietnam War, because in early 1972, I would say it was very clear to the United States that the costs of continuing the war in Vietnam were too high, and the United States had to somehow disentangle itself from the Vietnam War. And at the same time, I think there's also a growing understanding that what the American leadership calls Vietnamization is also not working very well at all. Okay? And that will be confirmed later on. So the Nixon strategy to open relations with the People's Republic of China is in many ways a brilliant one. It starts in 1971 with the ping pong diplomacy, the visit of table tennis teams, American table tennis teams to China, and then followed by Kissinger's visit to Beijing, and then Nixon in the spring of 1972. And for the Vietnam War, that has very traumatic effects, because once you establish that the United States and communist China can in fact have workable relations, the whole strategic thinking about Vietnam changes dramatically. Because from the 1950s on, the United States motivation to become involved in Vietnam was in large part based on the fear that behind the Vietnamese communists were the Chinese communists. It's a misreading, right? So the Americans are misreading the situation in Vietnam. They think that Ho Chi Minh is simply following orders from Mao Zedong. Very wrong, but that's what they think. And so part of the motivation to become involved in Vietnam was to stop the expansion of Chinese communism. Once in 1972, Chinese-Vietnamese relations have show the possibility of improving. You take China out of the Vietnam War, right? And at the moment in 1972, when the United States desperately wants to get out of Vietnam and does not have very much confidence in the Army of the Republic, so the Saigon Army, that took the main fear of a Chinese communist expansion out of strategic evaluations of the American leadership. And from then on, you can actually see why in the summer and fall of 1972, the American leadership is making concessions to the leadership in Hanoi, in particular Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. Right? Le Duc Tho and Kissinger come to an agreement by September, October 1972, which means the withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam. And you cannot think about this without understanding Nixon's trip to Beijing. It's that important.